Ready? Okay. Well, hello again, everybody. We're excited to have again Joel Stone, Senior Curator of the Detroit Historical Society. He was here in January or December talking all about the rum running in Detroit with a fantastic presentation. He'll be speaking tonight about the shipwrecks of the Great Lakes and the treasures they hold for the historians and divers. Please help me in welcoming Joel Stone.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Megan, for putting this all together. Randy gives all the credit for this to Megan. This is a wonderful gathering of people. It's nice to see the room full all the time. Every time I'm here, it's great. We are talking about shipwrecks, and I based the title on this from an exhibit we did probably about 10 years ago. Committed to the deep, and of course that has to do with the loss of sailors, the loss of people riding on the boats. But it also has to do with the dedication that maritime professionals, museum professionals, archaeologists, anthropologists have to exploring and understanding our maritime history based on their commitment to the deep. That's an important part of this. Now, I always have kind of a problem speaking about shipwrecks because I'm a ragboater. It's kind of nice to be here. My first time here, I was talking about Albert Kahn, and of course, he had a lot to do with what we were doing here. And I'm speaking, I know, to a bunch of people who love airplanes, and I'm a boat guy. They're both crafts in one way or another. They both deal with a lot of the same dynamics and propulsion. Of course, we don't have jets on most of the boats I ride on, but a ragboater originally, and then I learned to do some power boating too, stink boating. But I was talking with Lauren over there. We had a great time talking about boats, and I like boats when they're on the surface. Okay, so talking about them underwater is kind of a whole different, it's something I had to get used to. I should say right off the bat, I'm not a diver. I learned to dive, but I never did get the certification. I tried it a couple of years ago, and at my age, that's just not going to happen. The good thing is there are a lot of people doing it. They're taking wonderful pictures. I know Valerie Van Heest was here recently, and she just does some incredible things with diving and with airplanes. So she was probably the best of both worlds. Do I have to start over again? Okay. Anyway, so committed to the deep, this is where we're going with this. And I always like to start just to remind everybody of this wonderful resource that we've got that we get to play on. I have done some saltwater sailing, but freshwater sailing has got to be the best. The same way freshwater diving is the best. They got more colorful fish in the Caribbean, but if you want to look at shipwrecks, the Great Lakes is the best place to see them. The water's cold, the water's fresh, the water's clear, and it preserves these things much longer than anything can get preserved in salt water. So it really is a 6 quadrillion gallons of water. It's a pretty impressive thing. And frankly, these lakes will give you as much excitement as anything you can get on the ocean. I've talked to a lot of skippers, saltwater skippers who come to the Great Lakes and run into one of our storms, and they get religion. These lakes are a whole different thing, and there's a couple of reasons for that. We'll discuss that as we go through. Right off the bat, the physical nature of the lakes is completely different than what you'll run into on the salt water. The wave action is driven by wind, but also by proximity of the bottom to the surface. In other words, the shallower the water is, the quicker the wave action is. On the ocean, you can have a 30-foot wave, but it's got a very long moment. It rises up a long way and then it falls off a long way, and it's not likely to kill you. On the Great Lakes, because of the nature of the bottom being closer, Lake Erie being probably the worst, but even Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, the wave action is very choppy. The waves come very close together, and a 30-foot wave will just take your boat and flip it over. They're real scary. Ask the Edmund Fitzgerald folks. 30-foot wave on the lakes is a really tough thing. Shore proximity, whole different game for guys on the lakes, sailing the lakes, whether you're on a sailboat or on a 1,000-foot freighter. If you're on the ocean and you run into a storm, you turn tail and you run. And chances are you've got 3 or 4 days before you hit something. If you're on almost any of our lakes and you turn tail and run, you got 3 or 4 hours before you hit something. So you have to deal with that completely differently. The rivers, especially for the commercial sailors, if you're going into the Calumet or the Cuyahoga, even the Detroit River, the St. Mary's River, you've got to be a pretty skilled pilot. Whereas if you're sailing on some of the saltwater vessels, not to detract from the saltwater sailors, but as long as your pilot gets you out of New York Harbor, if you're on your way to Hong Kong, you're not really negotiating anything except maybe the Suez Canal until you get there. And the skill level for the guys on the lakes who are steering the boats down these rivers is incredible. Shallow harbors. You know, we've been dealing with silt. The Army Corps of Engineers used to take the silt out fairly regularly. The money has not been there, and our harbors are shallow. So it dictates how you deal with those. It also dictates how our boats are shaped. Frequent stops. This is a good thing and a bad thing. You leave from New York, you're heading for London. Your crew, really, other than shipping paint, doesn't have a whole lot to do for 5-10 days. You leave Duluth with a load of taconite, and you're heading down to the Rouge River. You got about a day and a half. And the loading process, the unloading process keeps your crew very busy. There's not much downtime in between there. And primary cargoes. The Great Lakes ships are specially designed to carry cargoes that are pretty particular. And we haven't gotten into the roll-on, roll-off or the container ships very much, but our ships are designed to carry taconite, which is iron ore, coal, rock, aggregate, wheat, and pretty much those things. And our ships are designed to do that. They're the most efficient vessels in the world. As far as the sailor's life goes, here we go. There we are. That's it. Nature of shipboard life is much different on the lakes. Sailors over years have gotten a bit of a reputation, kind of wild when they're in port and kind of wild when they're on the boats. I would say of the saltwater vessels. And frankly, if you're on a boat with a bunch of other guys for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, when you get off and you got a chance to go to the bar, you might get a little crazy. Because of what happens here on the lakes, especially with the quick turnaround, there isn't that opportunity. These guys they don't drink on the boats anymore. They're not going up to the VAR very often unless a conveyor breaks or an engine breaks down. And most of them spend their entire lives. I know lots of guys who spent their entire lives with the same company. In the last century and the century before that, a lot of the times, especially on the schooners, your uncle may own the boat. His wife, your aunt, is the cook, and his 3 sons and you are the crew. So there's a very, very tight community among the sailors here in the Great Lakes. When we lose a vessel, be it the Bradley or the Cedarville or the Fitzgerald, that community's hit pretty darn hard. Everybody knows each other very well. Government regulations, for better or for worse, favor American sailors. It doesn't favor the American merchant marine, but the sailors live a whole lot better. They have the opportunity to eat better. They have larger bunk spaces. There's a hospital facility on board most boats. They have redress. If the skipper throws them off, they at least have an opportunity to get paid. For most of the vessels that are sailing the world, that's not the case. And our merchant marine has shrunk. It's down to about 800 vessels now. About half of those are cruise ships, whereas the top 5 countries around the world that are doing most of the sailing have over 15,000 vessels. So we're really the American merchant marine. It's a hole in our defense system that I don't think people pay attention to. Amenities and perks. The amenities are, frankly, you get to eat well. Okay, if you're stopping the boat every couple of days in a port, there's somebody there that's going to bring you fresh vegetables, fresh meat, fresh anything. In fact, we've got the J.W. Westcott here on the river that'll bring you a pizza. They'll bring you your dry cleaning. They'll bring you anything you need. So that's a real perk. And if you have to get off for a wedding or a funeral or a kid's birthday, You probably can. You can probably get somebody to take your shift while they sail from the Rouge up to Duluth and back, and then you get back on the boat, which is something saltwater sailors very seldom get an opportunity to do. And we have a special nomenclature here. The guy who steers is a wheelsman as opposed to a helmsman. We have, and this is by government rule, if you go into a freighter, up in front of the guy who steers, there's a sign that says left and right. Not to say that the sailors don't know what port and starboard is, but by law, if you got somebody that you just picked up off the dock and you put him at the wheel, he can figure out what right and left is. So there is some unusual nomenclature that goes with the Great Lakes that makes us particular. Whoops. The storms of November are real. They're something that, of course, Gordon Lightfoot wrote about. This is a vessel from back about 1920, much lower freeboard, but this is not unusual. I've talked to lots of guys who have been up in the pilot house in a storm, and they'll look back and all they see is their smokestack. The storms of the lakes can get pretty ugly. Also, the fact that November's pretty tough. If you look some of the major storms as we go down there, the storm of 1913 probably the largest one, but there was another one I was just reading about in 1893 that happened on Lake Erie, claimed 6 or 7 boats. Most of these happened in November, with the exception of the Black Friday storm, and most of them, now the Fitzgerald was lost on November 10th. We've got the Armistice Day storm November 11th. Storm of 1835, November 11th. There's something about in the storm of 1913 right around that same period. There's something about that week. That's a good time if somebody asks you to go fishing, not to go. So the nature of Great Lakes ships, and before we talk about them on the bottom, I'm going to run real quickly through the vessels that are typical of the lakes. This is kind of a timeline. Canoes were viable time immemorial up to about 1900. Canoes were still a major cargo carrier, especially in the fur trade in the North Country, right up through about 1900. We had sailing ships starting as soon as Europeans got here. The Griffon, the first European-built boat, the first shipwreck. Once we figured out how the lakes were made, how shallow the harbors were, how the winds and the waves worked, we started designing different vessels, different types of ships that were more capable than the European big, deep draft, round, bluff of bow, bluff of stern vessels. We made vessels that were much quicker. Bulk carriers, of course, are the freighters, the workhorses that take care of us, and self-unloaders is kind of a variation on that, whereas the bulk carriers would have to have some kind of a crane operation or a hewlett that would take stuff out of them when they got where they were going. The self-unloaders can actually pull up wherever they want. They've got a conveyor that goes off to the side. They can unload themselves in 3 or 4 hours. Again, very efficient. And then passenger packets, which started 100 years ago on the Upper Lakes, 200 years ago, 1817 and 1818, 17 on the Lower Lake, Ontario, 18 on the Upper Lake. We had our first steamship arrived in Detroit 200 years ago in August. I mentioned the canoes, wonderful vessels, one of the best things that ever designed for mariners. They can be built anywhere. They can be repaired anywhere. 2 men can turn it over and carry it across a portage if they have to. A Hudson Bay boat like this could be paddled by 4 or 6 people, but it would carry up to 4 tons of fur in a bark-built boat. Pretty darn incredible. And again, you can build them any place. You run it on a rock, you can pull over and fix the thing. Dugouts, probably the oldest type of boat, but not very common. This one was actually a Native American coming over from Walpole Island to Tajmu Park about 100 and some years ago to sell souvenirs. But they found these things in Walled Lake. They found them in Orchard Lake. They have been part of our heritage. I mentioned the European type vessels. These are the ones that the navies built when they first got here. Of course, the French, followed by the British, and eventually the Americans were building vessels like this. Square-rigged vessels. A square-rigged vessel like this would probably, of this size, would probably take a crew of 30. A full-size barkentine would probably take a crew more like a 40 or 50. We've kind of fixed that by building something called the Great Lakes schooner. This is a 3-masted schooner, could be crewed by a crew of 5, maybe 6. And on a square rig vessel, you have to send the crew up into the rigging in order to furl the sails. Everything on a schooner can be operated from the deck, which from a safety standpoint is huge. That triangular sail on the foremast there is called a raffee, and the Great Lakes are already the only place you're ever going to find something like that. So very, very unique. Schooners had their day, and in the 1880s, there were probably 3,000 of them operating in the lumber trade for the most part. They did carry iron, although iron was pretty hard on the hull. They often carried wheat, but there were lots and lots of them. The biggest problem was they could not navigate a river. They might be able to sail down it if the wind was right, but getting up it would just take too long. So what they did is they started getting steam tugs that would tow them. And they would just line them up. And in this case, this was the world's record that took place down the Detroit River. You can see Peace Island in the background there and Windmill Point off to the side. This was 8 vessels being towed by the Champion. And this lithograph became hugely popular back about 1886, I think. What they did then was they realized that if you're going to be having a steam tug tow the vessel, you might as well just have the steam tug keep towing the vessel. It was easier. You could reduce the number of crew on the schooners, and you could also turn the vessel into a cargo carrier itself. And this is kind of the genesis, going from a steam tug to an actual freight carrying vessel. And these guys would usually have 1 or 2 consorts that they'd be pulling behind them. They evolved over time into very long, thin vessels, dictated by the size of the locks up at Sault Ste. Marie or the Wayland Canal. But most of what we were dealing with was going from Cleveland or Detroit up to Duluth or the Mesabi Iron Ranges up out of the Upper Peninsula or Minnesota. One of the things they did, you can see that all those hatch covers are very even spacing. They were able to, if you've been up to Marquette or Ashtabula, Ashland, Wisconsin, they huge docks that they would pull these up to. Railroad cars would bring the ore off on the top of the dock. They'd have chutes that would fall down at exactly those distances, and they could load these vessels by gravity in a matter of an hour or 3, starting 120 years ago. So this was really, really efficient. Getting them unloaded was a different story, but that's why they developed, here you can see the Bradley that had this conveyor that can swing off to either side. There's a conveyor that's at the bottom of the hull, and there are doors that open up that allow the cargo to fall onto that conveyor. The conveyor travels the length of the hull, carries the stuff up to the transfer arm and off to the side, and they can pull up anywhere. There doesn't have to be any unloading equipment, and they're hugely effective. Today we've got these 1,000-foot vessels. Pardon me, a 1,000-footer would replace 3 or 4 Edmund Fitzgeralds, and an Edmund Fitzgerald replaced 4 or 5 of the 500-foot boats. It's all a matter of geometry, and these are incredibly efficient ships, and they're as big as we can get through the locks up north. I should say the lock up north. We've only got one. If that lock goes down, the U.S. steel industry is going to have a serious, serious problem. We also carried railroad cars. This is an interesting one we'll touch on a little later. These were vessels that you would pull several railroad cars between 18 and 24 into the back of the boat. They'd back up to a dock. The railroad cars would come on, and they would cross either Lake Erie or Lake Michigan. The Badger is kind of a variation on that very same thing, carries automobiles now. We also in Detroit and Port Huron, had just river ferries that would carry vessels across, and these guys could keep the waters open most of the year. They would carry, in this case, the Lansdowne would carry 18 railroad cars. About every half hour, it would go one way, and then the unload, reload, go the other way. So in an hour, they would be able to transfer up to 36, and in the case of a couple of others, over 40 cars an hour, and do it around the clock around the year. We also had things like this, fish tugs kept all that great whitefish coming into us. And there are a few of these still left, but there used to be hundreds. The palace steamer era was pre-Civil War, and they had these wonderfully long vessels. If you're a diver and you're looking for one of these, you're looking for gold. These were tremendously beautiful boats at the time. They were wood built so that they were very flexible, very lightly built in order to get speed. And there's a number of them, because that if in the case of this one, it was hit by a two-masted schooner, less than 100 feet long, pierced this vessel because of its light build all the way to the keel. The schooner pulled out and continued on to Chicago with no damage. This vessel sank in a matter of minutes. So there are a bunch of them on the bottom of the lakes if you're looking for that. We also had things like this, kind of fell into the same category of the Lowe Boats. These were river vessels that carried people up and down the St. Clair River, up and down the Detroit River to various amusement parks and things like that. How many shipwrecks? I usually go with 3,000 plus. There are people that say up to 10,000. Dave Swayze's got a great website that lists almost 5,000 shipwrecks. Why the variation? Why is there such a broad sway in the number of boats that we're calling shipwrecks? It depends on how you define a shipwreck. I didn't get into it. There are vessels that were sunk in the Detroit River. People died. They raised the vessel. It ran for a while. The Mataafa was a famous one. It came out of Duluth, realized it was going into a bad storm, turned around, tried to get back into Duluth, and a wave picked it up and turned it into the breakwall, split it in half, and it sat there for a day or two while the crew froze to death. People in Duluth were watching. There was nothing they could do because of the storm. Horrible shipwreck. They raised the boat, they patched it up, and it ran for another 30 years. So does that count as a shipwreck or not? That's why the numbers vary so greatly. A lot of the wrecks in the Detroit River, if they weren't raised, they dynamited them. They just blew them up because they were a hazard to navigation. So those aren't even worth going to look for. So this is the kind of thing you can get when you're out there sailing, and it caused plenty of wrecks. I mentioned the very first one, the Griffon. This was built by LaSalle, Rene LaSalle, when he was exploring the Great Lakes. He built it over near Black Rock, near Buffalo, and had already sent an advance party up to Green Bay to collect furs from the Native Americans. And so he sailed across Lake Erie, past Detroit, up around the top of Mackinac, past Death's Door into Green Bay. They stopped there, loaded up the boat full of furs. LaSalle and several of his party continued in canoes because they wanted to find the top of the Mississippi and the bottom of the Mississippi. Very ambitious guy. And he sent this back with his first mate, heading back to take the furs to Montreal and make him a rich man and pay for this trip up and down the Mississippi. The boat took off and sailed into a huge storm. LaSalle and his guys in canoes spent the next 3 days on the beach. They couldn't even get in the water. This vessel was never seen again by Europeans. Native Americans have spoken of it being found in having seen it out there struggling through the storm. And today, shipwreck researchers have been looking for it for a long time. Here's the path of the vessel. You can see it going around there up to Death's Door. It left there, and people have been looking for this ever since, and they keep finding it. 1950, they found it over near Tobermory. In fact, they brought over French archaeologists. They were sure they had found the Griffon, and they had not. 1970s, they thought they found it off of Manitoulin Island. I was up in Gore Bay there, and the little museum's got a whole room dedicated to the not finding the Griffon. A guy in 1990 thought he found it up in the Canoes, and I saw his presentation. Very, very convincing. He had done some wonderful diving. He did comparisons with the way that the keel was put together and the way that the ribs entered the keel and were held on, and it was all very good, but it was all pretty period. There was no conclusive evidence that what he found was that. And then, of course, Steve LeBaire claimed that he found it. He's a guy out of Virginia who's got a summer home up near Charlevoix. And he, kind of going by the Native American narrative, decided that he was going to look over in this area. And he did a lot of searching, spent a lot of money, and he claims to have found it. The only evidence we had was a log sticking out of the bottom of the lake. Literally, that was it. And he brought over French archaeologists because the state of Michigan, and we'll touch on these laws later, the state of Michigan claimed the wreck immediately. As soon as he announced he had found it, the state is allowed to have what's ever on the bottom land. And we'll discuss that as we go forward. But there's precedent for this. He immediately went to the French, and the French claimed the wreck, which is the way things work, because initially when even, back in the 1920s, some folks had thought they'd found one of the old Confederate blockade runners over near the French shore. Of course, they were over there trying to get support. I think it was the Savannah, but I'm not sure. And the Americans threw up their arm and said, that's one of our warships. And maritime law gave them the right to do it. It went to court. They found in favor of the Americans. More recently, LaSalle, when he did his trip up to the top and then the bottom of Mississippi, when he got down to the bottom of the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico, built another vessel much like the Griffon, and it got wrecked off of Galveston. And some folks out of Texas A&M, I believe, their archaeology program, were working and found it. And immediately the French government stepped in and said, that's our war vessel. And it went to court, and it was adjudicated that that was French. Now, the French allowed the A&M archaeologists to do the archaeology. They've done they went down, put a big cofferdam in, got it all up. It's in a museum. It's a wonderful thing to see. So when Lebert found this and the state claimed it, he went to the French government, and they came over and they claimed it. And in fact, it became a French warship. This log sticking out of the bottom of the lake. The lawyers are the ones that made out on this one. They took the log out. They did some dendrochronology testing the wood, and it dates to about the same time. But that means that that's a log that has been on the bottom for a long time. It actually looks more like a fishing stake that you'd put in to hold fishing nets. That's what the state archaeologist is arguing. Lebert swears this is the Griffon. He's gone out there with subsonic testing equipment and magnetometers because it supposedly has some cannons on it. And I don't think he's gotten anything positive, but he hasn't given up yet. So stay tuned. We may still find the Griffon. They're looking for it. So finding wrecks and then researching wrecks. This is what the guys who enjoy doing this, and not all of them are divers, but a lot of them are. Finding a wreck sometimes is just a matter of walking down the beach. This is over at Indiana Dunes, just south of Michigan City, or I guess west of Michigan City. And this is an old schooner, probably pre-Civil War, 1830, 1840, and it's just sitting there. You can walk up and just start looking at it and study whatever you want. There's a group there. They've not been able to identify the vessel, but finding a registry number on a vessel that's in this kind of shape is going to be pretty tough. I mentioned Tobermory. Tobermory is pretty cool. There's all kinds of wrecks up there. It's kind of a place where divers go, but this one is just 5 feet underwater. Just deep enough that if you go over it in a dinghy, you're not going to hit it with your outboard motor. But even for non-divers or people that just snorkel, this is a deck. This is a deck that you can explore. You can see exactly how the ship was built. Not hard to find and not hard to get excited about. These are kind of fun. A lot of times it takes going into the libraries and digging through and finding old lake disasters in the newspapers. And this one's talking about the Jack and the Norman, and it tells you that the steamer Norman was collided with opposite Middle Island, so that gives you an idea where it is. Sank immediately, and that would be a place in 300 feet of water around Middle Island where you would start looking for it. This is a diary, a logbook that was oddly enough, from that 2-masted schooner that ran into the Lady Elgin, but a couple of years earlier. And if you could read the script, it basically said that they sailed by the masts of a boat that had sunk. And if you follow through the logbook, you can pretty well figure out where that boat sank, and you can go out there and you can start looking for it. And the techniques for doing that have improved. We'll talk on that in a second. The charts are pretty good about this. This is a chart from Russell Island, so up near Harson's Island, and there's a shallow area where they used to beach old boats. Once a boat had lived out its life, they would just pull it into the shallows, let it sink, and eventually maybe rot. But that little football symbol there, is this I'm sure there's a, there we go. Those little football symbols indicate a wreck. Now, even better, Google Earth. Okay, you go to Google Earth, you get in there, and if you know what you're looking for, you can find the dark spots that are probably wrecks. And they're finding wrecks all the time using this kind of thing. If you get the right light on whatever the satellite shot, you can identify wrecks they're finding. And you can do it in your pajamas sitting at home, which is a lot of fun. Sometimes it's not quite that easy. The Seabee Lockwood sank in Lake Erie. Nobody died. The Coast Guard went out and they put buoys on it and they marked it, figured out where the lat launch was. And then the Corps of Engineers went out and did the same thing. So there's two very solid bodies of evidence as to where the Seabee Lockwood should be. And some guys out of Cleveland Underwater Explorers, went out to find it. And they got down and they got right on the lat launch, right where they should have been, and there was nothing there. Well, that's not true. There was a little davit sticking out of the sand. And that's all there was. They couldn't find anything else. It was the end of the season. They were frustrated. They went home. They dug through the books. They were trying to figure out what was wrong. They went out the next year with a magnetometer, which is a thing that measures where metal is, and they dragged that over the top, and the Seabee Lockwood is there. It's just that Lake Erie's bottom is so aqueous that it sunk right down in and swallowed up a ship that size. So even if you know where the wreck is, finding it isn't necessarily easy. New technologies for finding them. So you've read over the diaries, you've read over the log books, you know what you're looking for. How do you find it? The old day would have been two guys with a really, really long rope that would get them between two boats and would just drag it along the bottom. And when they caught something and the boats came together, you knew you'd had to follow the line down to the bottom. Yeah, not terribly efficient, but if that's what you had to work with, that's what you did. Of course, with the advent of sonar, and sonar fishes, this fish is now 20 years old. They've got things that are a whole lot more efficient. But it would attach to a big reel of cable, and the cable would attach to a computer, and you'd have a readout there. And what you'd see, you drag that thing back and forth, and the after scope there, the yellow, would be the sonar. The forward one, most of the guys I know that do this will carry a camera also ahead of that so that they almost pick it up on their camera before they pick it up on the sonar. But that guy's just about to get it, and you drag that around, and what you do is you just go back out and you go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth over a grid until you find some. It's called cutting the grass. And, you may do this over 16, 17, 30 grid spots before you find what you're looking for. Because when a vessel in the logbooks or in a report indicates it went down here, well, it may have gone down, but it may have drifted. It may have gone down at an angle, and so it ended up someplace else. So finding them not so easy even with the sonars. This is what you're looking at. Now, this is about a 15 or 20-year-old sonar picture, and the prop wash running down the center, but you can see right here, there is clearly the wreck that the guy's looking for. Underwater trench, there's something over here, too. If I were him, I'd go back and check. And this has got a range of about 400 feet on either side. In fact, they're much greater range now. And just like high-res television, the resolution has improved tremendously, so you can actually get a sonar feedback that you can identify how many hatches there were, how many masts the boat had, how long it was. That alone could be the amount of information you need to identify or probably identify that wreck, so that the underwater technologies have gotten so much better. Well, if you're a diver, and you've done this, then you got to go down. You just got to go down and see it. And of course, in the old days, they did it this way, and it was pretty ugly. Most of the time, these guys would go down to salvage a cargo off a vessel. Lots and lots of times there were rumors that, such and such a vessel was carrying gold, or it was carrying the pay for the Union Army, or, there's a safe full of something down there, and that's what these guys would go down. Lots of guys have died in the hard hat suits looking for that kind of treasure. That has changed immensely. Of course, the World War II brought us the scuba technology, and scuba technology has gotten, I don't want to say carefree, but it is so secure and trustworthy now that it's wonderful. The person on the right-hand side there is just a standard scuba single tank, and that is probably good comfortably down to 100 feet, easily to 150. Good scuba divers could probably get it to 175 feet. The guy on this side, or gal on this side, it's hard to tell when they put the mask on, isn't it? They're doing what's known as technical diving, and this involves several kinds of gases. Of course, nitrogen being a big problem when you go down. If you come up too fast, the nitrogen in your system will kill you. So as they go down, they've got computers on their wrists that tell them how to change the mixture of the gas. Three different, I think it's oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And so they're busy adjusting the gases that are going in as they go down, and the depth is really important. These guys will go down easily 300-400 feet. The Edmund Fitzgerald sits in 530 feet of water. Rick Mixter, has Rick been out here? Rick Mixter would be a good guy to get here because he's a pilot, he's a diver. He also is an incredible videographer, so you might want to get him out and have him talk about some of the cool stuff he's found. Rick went down on that, so 530 feet, and I've heard of guys getting down to 600 feet on Trimix. And unfortunately, now that you got the mixture working, your lungs are fine, your blood system's fine, the pressure and the anxiety in your brain. I've talked to these guys, their eyes are going in different directions. They're looking at their depth meter. They're looking at their clock every 10 seconds. They're not really enjoying themselves. They're getting down there. And if you're going down that deep, you have to decompress coming back up. No matter what you're breathing, you have to decompress. And if you go down to 500 feet, you're going down, it probably takes you 10 minutes to get down there. You probably get about 10 or 15 minutes on the wreck, and then you'll spend an hour and a half decompressing as you come up. So really, you have to, when you get down there, you got to really want to go. And when you get down there, you got to know what you're looking for. Make sure you capture it on your cameras, get whatever record you need of that vessel, because that time coming up gives you a whole lot of time to think about the next time you go down. You can do something like this. They did use one of these on the Edmund Fitzgerald, a hard suit, completely hard, all articulated. It's got cameras and lights on it, and you're basically inside a small submarine. You rely on a crane to put you down and get you back up, but you're not getting compressed. The compression is a huge factor. If you have plenty of money, get yourself sub. You can put beer in the cooler and go down and take all the time you want. You can breathe just regular oxygen. Nice way to go, but you better have a pretty deep pocketbook. What they rely on more than anything now are remotely operated vehicles, ROVs. This one I think is down on the Titanic. But this way you can send them down. They've got grappling equipment. They've got photographic equipment. They've got lights. They can do measuring. All kinds of things that you can do, and nobody's in the water. There's no danger of somebody dying from going down as deep as they need to go. And this is a relatively inexpensive thing. Lots of universities have these and do a lot of exploration using this kind of technology. Now, once you find it, and once you get down there, you really, really have to document it quickly, especially in the world of zebra and quagga mussels. Getting a wreck documented is a relatively easy process, but it's very, very important. You can do it with photography. You can do it with sonar. A lot of times taking a series of pictures and kind of muraling them together, you can get a pretty good idea of what a vessel looks like. They also do basic archaeology, just like you would on a Mayan pyramid. You set down a trace line that's your center line and measure everything off of that. And they've got writing equipment that you can use underwater that helps you record this, and then you get that data up to the surface and capture it. Bringing things up, we'll discuss that in a minute, but most of these things have changed. Nowadays, if you find a wreck, you leave stuff there. That's not the case, and I say no ill to the guys who started this. When you were diving in the 50s or the 60s, the reason you went down was to bring up cool stuff. That's why you did. You brought up plates, you brought up bells, you brought up anchors, you brought up, they're sitting in people's front yards. You can see them. The steering wheels have disappeared from so many vessels, and there came a time, partly by law, but partly by the academic community kind of came in and started putting some pressure on. And frankly, a lot of the guys that do this are historians. They're anthropologists. And they understand the fact that as soon as you pick something up and move it on a vessel, you've changed the story of that artifact. You've changed the story of what happened. And these guys are often trying to figure out exactly what happened. They'll look at the rudder angle because they will have read that the vessel went around in circles and ran over half of its crew while it was sinking, and they'll get down there and the rudder angle is straight. So the vessel didn't go around in circles. They'll look at where the vessel was hit. They'll get into the cabin. They'll see, so many times people were eating when these things went down. So you can see what were they eating? People have brought up bottles of ketchup, bottles of wine, things that were down there that are still in very, very good shape. They don't do that anymore. Now you leave that because they're a record of how people sailed and how the people who were sailing lived and how they, that's how you understand kind of how they thought. Things that do come up need to be conserved, whether it's iron or it's wood or it's leather. There are different ways of treating that, and they do need to be treated. I don't know, has anybody been up to Alpena to see the NOAA museum up there? If you get a chance, go up there. They've got a wonderful preserve I'll mention in a minute, but NOAA put in, and this is federal dollars at work. I wish I had their money. They put in a really nice interpretive museum, and the windows you see at the end there, that's the lobby. So that anybody who comes into this can look into this conservation lab, where here we've got a highly underpaid intern who's busy, probably writing down nails that were brought up maybe 100 years ago just to get the record of these kinds of things and getting them cataloged. And that's a whole another part of the business. Now, a lot of things changed based on this, and this is, I call, the tale of two disasters. This is a boat built in Detroit, Alvin Clark, and in Clark Street. And no Clark Street, John Clark. He had a dry dock because he had a business of fishing. And in order to get his fish to the East Coast, he needed salt. So he built boats to bring salt to Detroit, oddly enough. He wouldn't have done that today, but he did. He had to go to Oswego to get salt, which meant passing the Whalen Canal and get it back here, salt the fish, and then he'd take the fish back on the trip to Oswego, and it would get on the Erie Canal and end up in New York. So he built several boats. He had a dry dock down there and a shipbuilding yard. He built this one, named it after his son Alvin, used it for several years, and then we discovered we had salt around here, so he didn't need it anymore. He sold it to another Detroiter who used it in the lumber trade. Those guys sold it to another group of investors from over in Green Bay, and they were operating arguably in the illegal lumber trade, where they were taking lumber off of federal lands and selling it. And they had a hot load, and they took it to Chicago and got rid of it quick and could not find a return load. You always like to take something back when you go. So they were heading up to Green Bay, to Menominee, and because they had nothing in the hold, they had all the hatch covers off, drying the boat out. Biggest problem you got with a boat is too much water in it. And they were drying it out, and they got hit by a squall, and the vessel rolled over with the hatches all over it, filled with water, and sank immediately. Two of the guys died, three of them survived, and the vessel went down in 105 feet of water. It's 105 feet long, and it was down there for 105 years. I love when things work out like that, right? I can remember that. So what happened was the vessel's on the bottom, standing up, but we don't know this yet. There's some guys who just bought a brand new fishing net, and they're out fishing, and the net gets tangled. They don't want to lose their net or the catch that's in it, so they hire the guy in the striped shirt, Frank Kaufman. And Frank owned a bar, but he also owned scuba gear. And so he was hired to go down, and he went down there to get the net, was able to get the net, but what he saw, it was tangled on a post, a log sticking out of the bottom. He followed the log down. The visibility was pretty bad, Green Bay having a name for a reason. And he got down there and he realized this was a ship. This was a good old schooner, pre-Civil War probably. And so he rallied divers all over the Midwest. People came in and helped him. They went down and first kind of sussed it out one year. The next year they went down and they had, luckily, Marinette Marine. Marinette and Menominee are right next to each other. Marinette Marine had all the gear he needed. So they went out there with an old landing craft and a bunch of suction pumps. They sucked all the thousands of tons of silt out of it. They trussed it underneath in several spots, got one of the Marinette's barges over the top of it, slowly hoisted the boat up under the barge, and little by little worked it in. And they got it into Marinette, and here it is. They're pulling it up. Once they got it up high enough and they were able to get pumps into it, they pumped it out and it floated like the day it went down. Perfectly preserved. The rigging, the lines were gone, but the masts were still there, the booms were still there, and the boat floated like the day that it had gone down. It was a tremendous capture. Here it is. They turned it into a museum. Great idea. A couple of problems there. First, anybody been to Marinette? It's a long way from anywhere. Okay, so you really gotta want to go there if you're going. The second problem was that he triple mortgaged the bar, spent everything he owned to get the boat up, figuring that the federal government or the state of Wisconsin, Michigan, somebody would step in and preserve this thing. And at that time, we didn't have the grants that we have today. And we write grants all day long to try to get money from various locations. That really wasn't the way things were done back then. And nobody stepped forward. Nobody was interested in having this vessel. And if you bring something like this up and expose it to the air, it starts deteriorating immediately. And it really became a problem. It was spectacular. And I want you to note that winch there, that capstan, because we'll see that again in a minute. But it's just a perfectly preserved. Howard Chappell, who was the head of the maritime for the Smithsonian, said this is a real treasure ship. You know, you can find all the gold galleons you want, but this one tells us how people lived, how their boats were built, how they sailed. This was a real find. It was the oldest floating working vessel in the world. Just an absolute treasure. And unfortunately, there was no money. The boat continued to deteriorate. The banks started coming after Frank. At one time, he poured a bunch of gasoline on it and tried to burn it. Fireman showed up. He held him off with a shotgun. And these are the guys that drink in his bar, okay? They talked him down. They got him to it, but the banks kept coming. He was absolutely a wreck. At one point, and this is probably the best part of the story, at one point he called the curator before me at the Dawson Museum, and he said, "John, have you got a truck?" John said, "Yeah, I got a truck." He said, "Can you get over here tomorrow?" John said, "I can do that. Can you come at night?" John went over there. They put everything they could get into the truck that wasn't nailed down from the ship. They got it in there, and John brought it back to the Dawson, put it in boxes, and it sat there for 25 years. When John finally retired and I stepped in and I found all these boxes, I said, "What is this?" He said, "This is the Alvin Clark. This is what's left of the Alvin Clark." And he didn't say anything about it because he wasn't supposed to have it. If the banks had known, they probably would be coming after us, but we're talking about it now because I think the statute is out on it. Anyway, the boat just fell apart. In a matter of years, it was completely deteriorated. You can see the capstan has collapsed right through, and this wonderful treasure they ended up bulldozing it into a landfill, and it was gone in just a matter of years. So it changed the way we looked at this, and laws were passed. President Reagan signed the Bottomlands Act. Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Ontario all passed laws that says if you find something like this, leave it down there. Okay, it's best there. If you don't move it at all, we can tell the story. If you bring it up, this is what's going to happen. Nobody's got enough money to do that. So it really created a whole new approach to preservation. Now the stuff does stay on the bottom. Fortunately, we've got wonderful high-definition cameras that can go down and take pictures like Valerie Van Heest showed, that I don't have to dive. I can see what she's seeing. It's wonderful to see that stuff. We also passed a bunch of preserve laws, and frankly, Michigan is leading the way on this. Florida has, I think, 10 preserves, relatively small. We've got 13, I think 14 now, preserves all over the state. In fact, the one up at Alpena is about 3 times as big. I think they're going to downsize it a little bit. But these preserves in spots where shipwrecks usually happened have been set aside, and NOAA goes out and they put a buoy on it. So if you want to dive it, you don't go out and toss your anchor over the side and break something. Okay, there's a buoy there that's already tied down. You tie your boat to it. There's an app. Of course, there's an app. There's always an app. But there's also books you can read that tell you what to look for, tell you what the problems are. So if you're brave enough to dive into the hull of the boat, it'll tell you where the collapses are, things that are likely to go wrong, what to look for. And it's really much easier, and we've kind of built up a diving tourism that go to these places and follow these things, and it's a wonderful approach to that. New approach to education, too. This is a boat that sails out of Mount Clemens, and the Pride of Michigan is part of the Navy's cadet program. And Navy cadets come from around the country. Luke Clyburn runs this program. He actually lives up in White Lake. He and Kathy have been running this program for years, called the Noble Odyssey Foundation. If you ever hear of Luke Clyburn and the Noble Odyssey Foundation giving a presentation, go and see it, because they've got years of fun stuff. But they bring these cadets in. They're all high school students. I guess they start a few of them in 8th grade. But they teach them 2 things. First, they teach them to be polite. These people, they're kids in the Naval Cadet program, so they will yes, sir, and no, sir, you, just like any proper sailor will do. They are incredibly polite, but they also take them out there and they teach them bathymetry and limnology. They teach them how to dive. They teach, and they become tools for all kinds of people. Woods Hole, Michigan State University, University of Michigan. Lots of people come in and do research using Luke's platform and Luke's divers to do things like there was a river up at the Straits of Mackinac. The Straits didn't used to be that. Lake Michigan was much smaller. Lake Huron was smaller, and they were connected by a river. And there was a waterfall just to the east of the Mackinac Bridge. And they discovered that, and they went down and not only studied the waterfall, but there are caves along the sides. So they're in the caves looking for human evidence of human habitation. High school students, this is way cool. Lake Huron is very deep on the north end, but shallow on the south end. And many, many years ago, the lake was about 40 feet shallower than it is today, and much of Lake Huron was land. And there's evidence that hunters, prehistoric hunters, were using boulders to kind of capture elk the same way they used to use canyons out west to capture mustangs. Okay, they'd put boulders, and they weren't much bigger than this, but elk, I guess, are lazy and they won't step over them, so that they just put these boulders kind of in a big V, and they'd get these elk to kind of come into the V and into a pen where they could be killed or stored until they needed to kill them. And they found this on the bottom of Lake Huron, and these guys are doing this. Anaerobic sinkholes over near Alpena. They're doing some really wonderful research on the bottom, and in their spare time, they go out and play with shipwrecks. Okay, this is an excellent program. Detroiters should be really, really proud of this. There's nothing else like this on the Great Lakes. So there are people like us that support Great Lakes history, and we've been doing this for 60 years now. There are, oh heavens, there's probably 20 museums. When the Dawson opened, it was one of 3, and the first purpose-built building to tell Great Lakes history. And now there's about 20 museums. There's probably another 18 museum ships, and the Coast Guard's been getting rid of lighthouses, and each of those has a little museum in it. So there's now 100 places you can go and get this story. And all of these people are dedicated to maintaining this history and telling this history. And some of us get to have some fun with it. Now, this is the Gothic room down at the Dawson. This is the only surviving example of steamboat Gothic on the Great Lakes. And frankly, I have a whole program on just the steamboat, passenger steamboats of the Great Lakes. We've also got the pilot house from the William Clay Ford, which went out to look for the Edmund Fitzgerald. We've got an anchor that the Fitzgerald left in the Detroit River the year before it sank. Preserving hydroplane history in Detroit. These are all things that we have fun doing. Captain Erickson, who was the guy that went out to look for the Fitz, he died 2 years ago, but he used to come up and sit in his pilot house and just regale guests. There is no closer you can get to history than having the guy who did it tell you the story. We do tell stories. This was the exhibit that we did about underwater archaeology and the finding that is a door off the Alvin Clark that's back there. We've got some wonderful things from there. And then we're still finding things. Now, it's not a Mayan ruin, but a couple of years ago, the Detroit police divers, who really have an unpleasant job, they're looking for cars, guns, and dead bodies. But every once in a while, they have fun. And they were on the bottom, and they ran across the cannon. All right, it didn't quite look like that. But they were out. They do. There's an area called Chicken Bone Reef right about there. And this is where they do their test dives and their practice dives. And the visibility is usually really lousy. They had a good day, and they ran across this cannon on the bottom. Now, this is number 6. They have found 6 cannon within about the space of you to me, maybe you to the back of the room, that have ended up on the bottom. The British, we figure, they didn't want the Americans to get them back in 1796 when they were leaving. They hauled them out onto the ice, a distance away from each other so they didn't collapse the ice. When the ice went out, the cannon went down. And so we've been able to bring these up. They found this number 6 one covered with zebra mussels, and this is a problem. I mean, there's Tony Gramer who's doing a program at Washtenaw Community College in, I think it's March 3rd. It's the Great Lakes Shipwreck Festival. Tony Gramer runs it, and he has some wonderful footage of a wreck he filmed about 30 years ago, pre-quagga mussels, and everything is clearly visible. And he went down and recorded it again a year or two ago, and you can't tell the stove is a stove. You can't tell the fife rail is a fife rail. Everything is just covered with mussels, and which is why we record these things as quickly as we can. So the cops did their sonar. They kind of gave us an idea of what direction it was in before we moved it. How it was situated on the bottom, exactly where it was situated lat launch, so we know where it was. And then they got everybody together and look at the news cameras that are lined up along the rail there. They had a blast. This was like the only fun thing they'd been able to do in a while. And they brought it up. So this cannon had been down since 1796, breaks the surface for the first time, and they were stars. They were getting their picture taken, getting interviewed. Unfortunately, this fellow here is one of the cops that was killed last year. No longer with us. But these guys are doing a tough job. They do their regular police beat, and then they do the dive team on the side, the underwater recovery team on the side. And these are tough men. These are really great. We were able to get some things off of it. We established a date for it, which was kind of fun. This is the George Regis crest that was on all cannon that came out about this period, either George II or George III. We were able to establish it was George II. First thing we did was take it back and put it in a prepared bath. You put it back underwater so it doesn't start to deteriorate. There has only been one other cannon that was freshwater cannon that properly treated. Saltwater cannon I could find all kinds of data on, but there was only one other cannon. We got a hold of the woman who had done that. She helped us, figure out the best practices, how we had to deal with it, create a baseline as far as the water goes. We tested that, figured out a plan, found some money. That was, of course, the hardest part. And people were excited about this. This got more hits when we pulled that cannon out. We got hits from all over the world. People were excited about this. Didn't transfer into dollars, but it certainly was a lot of fun. So then we figured out how to do the electrolysis on it, which took about a year and a half, a very slow bubbling process, and then we got it out on display. One of the cool things we did, Cranbrook wanted to do an underwater thing, and they were partnering with Woods Hole, and so they did a thing about Great Lakes underwater archaeology, got a lot of our Alvin Clark stuff, and they took the cannon and put it over there, and they started the electrolysis, and about every 3 weeks, they'd pull it out and set it on gym mats on the floor and hand out toothbrushes to all the kids. And the kids would come up and they'd just start scraping. We're happy. If we can't get money for this, we at least can get free labor, right? And one of the kids scraped off one of the trunnions, and it had an H on the side of it, which was Hamsel Furnace in England, which only made cannons for 3 years. So we were able to not only identify where it was built, but when it was poured within a 3-year period, which was great. That really helped narrow it down. And then this was the other cool thing, working with the police divers. And this was one of those things where the electronics of today, the media of today really, really helped. The divers were down off of Alter Road over on the east side of Detroit. They were looking for a car. The visibility was terrible. One of the divers reached out and he grabbed an arm. And that's always a tough thing for those guys. But then he realized that it was either really bad rigor mortis or there was something else going on. And what was going on was it was a statue. And this was everything they could do to get their boat to pull this statue up on. It was a beautiful bronze statue. And so they took these photos with their phone. They sent the photos to me, who had an old-fashioned flip phone. I couldn't even download them, but I have younger people in my department who can. They downloaded them. We looked at them. We sent them off to a couple of people at our institution. And in fact, the CEO, who lived in Grosse Pointe, said, "That's a statue that was stolen from the Grosse Pointe War Memorial about 15 years ago." Immediately sent the pictures over to the War Memorial. They affirmed it. And by the time these guys got the statue to the Coast Guard station, who had a crane to pull it out, the War Memorial guys were already there waiting on it, claiming it. It was fun when things like that come together. The only drawback was War Memorial had been paid the insurance money, and they had to go back to the insurance company and discuss that with them. It was stored outside, which is probably how it got stolen. It's now stored inside, where we hope it won't get stolen again. And then there was an unusual week where I got a phone call, and anybody do any boating along Lake St. Clair, Grosse Pointe? Patterson Park is Grosse Pointe Park, one of Grosse Pointe Park's 2 parks. And it sticks out just a little bit into the lake. And about 300 yards off of Patterson Park, somebody called up and said, "I think I just found a shipwreck." And so I grabbed a couple of my diving buddies, and I got to be the dive coordinator who didn't have to go in the water. But this is what we found. And if you go to Google Maps and you go off of Patterson Park, you can zoom in, and there's what's left of probably a small collier, a small schooner on the bottom. Been really badly raked. It's but by ice over time. And so there's really not a lot to it, but clearly a shipwreck. And it sure is fun that we're still finding this kind of stuff every day. People will go out, they'll have found a wreck the day before, and they're on their way to that wreck, and they'll drive over another one. With the changing levels of the lake, moving silt and sand around, the shipwrecks are coming, and there are still a lot of people that are very, very dedicated to this, very dedicated to saving that history, capturing that history before the zebra mussels get to it. Not a zebra mussel on this thing. It was wonderful. Capturing that history, there's a commitment to this history that we really have to embrace, and I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come here and tell you about it. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. Yes, ma'am.
So I just watched a show not too long ago about all the aircraft that are in the Ferry Lakes.
Oh, sure. Yep. I meant to mention that. There's at least one DC-3 down there, and all kinds of stuff that came off of those flat tops over near the Chicago Naval Air Station. well, they came off of them and they didn't get up. They ended up down. There are, and I know that you guys are getting one. Megan was just talking about that, and that's going to be very, very exciting to have that on display here. I guess you get it in March, and it'll be open in October?
Well, it's kind of a special day.
Okay.
This airplane went in the water October 5th, 1993.
Okay.
And we're going to open the display October 5th, 2018, exactly 75 years later.
Those are fun when those happen, isn't it? That's great. So I'm looking forward to coming back for that. So that's I meant to mention that when I was going through all the different crafts that sail the Great Lakes, and of course there are airplanes down there.
The dugout that you had was about the third slide in.
Yeah.
Was that an old photograph or something brand new?
That photograph was from 1901.
There's in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, there's a black thing that looks like a bird with an oil contrail coming out behind it, like a phantom.
I'll have to go look at that again. I don't want to put people through me going back through all the slides, but I'll have to take a look. It's an old sepia tone glass negative that we've got.
Then I saw that, I said, oh, well, that's a duck. But then I looked further and it's got a contrail on it.
All right, it's right back at the very beginning. I've never known a duck to have a contrail. Well, all right, a very, very brief one, maybe. We had some of these, there it is. What is that, about number 10? Yeah.
Right there?
Nope, two more this way, toward me.
Dugout connect.
Right there, yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's just schmutz on the slide. So, or a flying saucer. We'll go with the flying saucer. If you get up to the Anthropology Museum at the University of Michigan, they've got a couple of these on display there. They were not uncommon. They're hard to build, a whole lot harder than a birch bark. They're not terribly wieldy, and they're really, really heavy. So if that's all you had, that was great. But if you could build a birch bark canoe, that's I'm sure what you do. So, yes, ma'am.
Years ago, there used to be a story that the Griffon had landed in Tawas Lake when it was open to the bay. And would that have come from stories around there then? And because that's a long way from over by Wisconsin.
Yeah. In that storm, I don't think it would have ever gotten there. And then getting into Tawas Lake, that would have been a real challenge. It was a deep draft vessel. It would have been really tough to get it up into any of the harbors around it. Other than doing the Detroit River. Or Black Rock, which was the Niagara River. It couldn't have gotten even into Buffalo. So, I'm sure that's a story. There are lots and lots of stories which are wonderful, and they're great lore, and I don't discount them. Lore is as much a part of our history as the actual fact. So I never discount that kind of thing. But I'd never heard that. Yes, sir.
Two questions. I thought the Clark was built in Trenton because it's on the Trenton seal.
Now I got to go look it up. They did have, what was the name of the town? Triago?
Trenton was Truaxton, Tuego, Trenton.
Yeah, okay.
It was Alvin Turner's shipyard down there.
Okay.
And that ship is on the seal of the city of Trenton.
Well, boy, I don't want to make them wrong, so maybe I won't even look it up and I'll just let you be right.
I've actually been on the Clark.
On the Alvin Clark? You were over in Menominee?
Yes.
Wow, okay.
Walk the hull of that thing and look at the way they had to twist the wood.
In order to get it to lay? So they didn't steam it? Okay. Well, that'll be interesting. I'd have to talk to you afterwards. Because I only know 2 or 3 other people that were able to do that. So that was pretty cool. Luckily, they got the lines off of it before it disappeared. Ted McCutcheon, who lives up in Walloon Lake, and his dad, who was a naval architect, they went up and very, very carefully took the lines off of that before.
I still got some pictures I took of that thing.
Really? Well, if you don't want them anymore.
I got them because artist did a picture of that. Ink and pen and ink.
Yeah.
Larry.
Oh, yeah, Jim Ferry.
I got the pictures I took up there, I've got them on in the same frame.
Oh, okay. That's pretty neat that you still got those, because I only know the ones that I was showing you that, what was her name? I won't remember just because I want to, but she took some very careful pictures too. So I'm sorry I missed it. That would have been, I would have loved to have gotten over there before it disappeared. So, well, again, thank you for having me. And, oh, yes, sir.
The statue for the War Memorial, do you know where is it displayed anywhere right now?
Yes, it's at the War Memorial. It's in there as kind of a walk-through between the Alger House and the ballroom. It's right inside there where the elevator, there's an elevator area, and then the statue's beautifully displayed. So if you get a chance, it used to be out right in front of the ballroom. There's a formal garden with a fountain in the middle, and that used to be in the middle of the fountain, which is why we figure, and I'm not sure what they would have done. Would they have stolen it and put it in a truck, and then why would they take it down to Alter Road to transfer it to a boat and drop it? Or better yet, they took it down to a boat, tried to get it out of the boat at Alter Road, and that's how they dropped it. That's my speculation, but we'll never know. Not unless those guys come to one of my presentations and raise their hand and say, "Hi, I can answer that."
What's that you made out of? Is this bronze?
Bronze, yep. Beautiful shape. It's an absolutely spectacular shape. So, probably. Yep. There was a point where several statues in that same time period disappeared from various Catholic churches. There was a kind of a spate of them. And after they lost with this one, I think it stopped, which was okay. So, well, thanks. And don't forget those free tickets. Membership. Thank you.